Spring 1944. A desk in Berlin. A single sheet of paper with 73 names handwritten. A man sits alone. He reads the list once. Then he picks up a pen and draws a slow line under the 50th name. These 73 men were Allied prisoners of war. They had done nothing except what the Geneva Convention entitled them to do: attempt to escape. That was their only crime. And now, one man had been told to choose 50 of them to die. Cross off 23, keep 50. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't request files or photographs or service records. He finished the list, set down his pen, and moved on to his next task. 50 men would die because his pen stopped where it stopped. The Great Escape, 73 names, 50 bullets. Who chose who would die? You think you know this story. Steve McQueen on a motorcycle, barbed wire, a leather jacket and a baseball glove. The music swells. Freedom. Forget all of it. No American took part in this escape. There was no motorcycle, there was no jump, and the 1963 film left out the part where 50 men were taken to remote roads across Germany and never came back. This is not that story. This is the real one. Stalag Luft 3 sat near Sagan in Silesia, 100 miles southeast of Berlin. It opened in September 1942. The Luftwaffe ran it, not the SS, not the Wehrmacht. That distinction will matter later, when Gestapo actions involved Luftwaffe prisoners, and the entire German military chain of command fractures over jurisdiction. The camp held somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 men. Almost all of them were pilots or aircrew, officers selected by their own militaries for intelligence, composure, and the ability to make decisions under impossible pressure. This was not a population that would sit quietly behind wire. The Germans knew it. That's why they'd built this particular cage. Stalag Luft 3 was specifically designed as a prison for men who had already escaped other camps. Persistent offenders, the Germans called them. Men who had tunneled out of camps in Poland. Men who had walked out in stolen uniforms. Men who had been caught, punished, transferred, and immediately started planning again. So the Germans engineered their problem away. Or tried to. The soil around Sagan was bright yellow, canary yellow. Any dirt brought to the surface from a tunnel would be instantly visible against the gray topsoil. Seismograph microphones were buried around the camp perimeter, sensitive enough to detect digging. The barracks were elevated on stilts so guards could see underneath. The buildings were set back from the fences to create a wide, no-man's zone. Every design choice said the same thing: don't bother. And for a while, it almost worked. The prisoners settled into a strange, structured captivity. They built a theater. They ran a radio station. They published 2 camp newspapers. A man named Tim Mundy, who in civilian life had been a master of King's College, Cambridge, organized a program of university-style lectures and courses. He'd been captured at Calais in 1940. 4 years later, he was still teaching. These men had built a functioning society inside barbed wire, but underneath it, literally beneath the floorboards, something else entirely was taking shape. Among the prisoners was a South African-born RAF squadron leader named Roger Bushell. The Germans had a file on him. He'd escaped twice before. The second time, the Gestapo had caught him. They interrogated him. They threatened him. And then a Luftwaffe officer told him plainly, "If you try again, we will end you." Bushell listened carefully. Then he started planning the largest escape in the history of the war. Roger Bushell, codenamed Big X, was a barrister in civilian life. Multilingual, charismatic, obsessively methodical. He didn't plan one tunnel, he planned 3 simultaneously. Tom, Dick, Harry. The logic was elegant. If the Germans found one tunnel, they'd celebrate. They'd assume that was the project. they'd relax, and the other 2 would keep going. 600 men were involved in the operation. 600. Not a dozen men with spoons. An industrial-scale covert engineering project executed under 24-hour surveillance. Harry, the tunnel that would eventually succeed, ran 336 feet, 30 feet underground. It had electric lighting, wired into the camp's own power grid. The prisoners had tapped the supply without the Germans noticing a single fluctuation. They built an air circulation system from modified kit bags, pumping breathable air through the entire length of the shaft. They constructed a wooden rail trolley, a functioning underground railway. Men lay flat on their backs and were pulled through the darkness on tracks made from bedboards. Those bedboards came from their own bunks. As the months went on, prisoners slept on increasingly precarious frames because the wood beneath them had been fed to the tunnel. Nobody complained. Forgers produced identity documents so precise they could pass Gestapo inspection. Tailors unpicked military uniforms and restitched them into civilian suits, complete with buttons carved from melted phonograph records. Map makers traced escape routes onto tissue paper. Every detail was planned. Every contingency accounted for. And then there was the sand. Bright yellow tunnel sand, impossible to hide, unless you were a penguin. That was the code name for the dispersal teams. They sewed long, thin bags inside their trouser legs, filled them with sand, and walked laps of the compound. A pin at the bottom of each bag released a thin stream of yellow earth through the leg opening, where it was scuffed into the gray topsoil with each step. Hundreds of men, hundreds of laps, day after day. The sand vanished. Then the Germans found Tom. September 1943. Guards discovered the entrance beneath a stove in Hut 123. Months of digging, months of engineering, destroyed in minutes. The camp security officer was triumphant. He filed his report. He assumed the escape operation was finished. This was exactly what Bushell had planned for. Dick was quietly converted into an underground storage facility for forged documents and escape equipment. Every resource, every man, every hour shifted to Harry. The Germans thought they'd won. They'd found exactly what Bushell wanted them to find, the decoy. By March 1944, Harry was complete. 336 feet of tunnel, shored and wired and railed, running from beneath Hut 104 toward the tree line beyond the wire. Bushell set the date, the night of March 24th. 200 men were selected. Each had forged papers, civilian clothes, a cover story, a mapped route to the nearest neutral border. What none of them knew was that the tunnel fell 30 feet short of the tree line. The night of March 24th, 1944, below Hut 104, 200 men waited in the tunnel entrance, pressed together in the dark, breathing recycled air. Silent. At 10:30, the exit shaft was opened, and immediately, disaster. The tunnel didn't end in the forest. It ended in open ground, 30 feet short of the trees, directly in the sight line of a guard tower. Every man who climbed out would have to lie flat in the snow, wait for the perimeter searchlight to sweep past, then sprint for the tree line. The carefully timed schedule, one man every 2 minutes, collapsed within the first hour. Then the lights went out. An Allied air raid plunged the entire region into darkness. Inside the tunnel, men couldn't see their own hands. A section of shoring collapsed, the trolley jammed on its rails. Panic rippled through 300 feet of underground corridor. Bushell's officers held the line. They cleared the collapse. They restarted the trolley. They kept men moving. By 5 in the morning, 76 men had crawled through the tunnel and vanished into the forest. The 77th was spotted by a guard as he emerged from the exit shaft. The alarm went up. The tunnel was found. The escape was over. But 76 were out. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in the history of the war. An estimated 70,000 German military personnel, police, Gestapo agents, and Home Guard were mobilized. Roadblocks went up on every major route. Railway stations flooded with plainclothes officers. The entire region, and then the entire country, locked down. The net was overwhelming. Men were caught at train stations, trying to board trains with forged papers that were hours out of date. Caught at border crossings, caught hiding in barns, in haystacks, in drainage ditches. Some lasted hours, some lasted days. 3 made it home, 2 Norwegians who reached Sweden, and a Dutchman who made it to Gibraltar. 3 out of 76. Within 2 weeks, 73 of the escapers had been recaptured. They were handcuffed, they were processed, and they expected what had always happened before. A return to camp, maybe solitary confinement, maybe a transfer. Instead, they were handed to the Gestapo. And in Berlin, the escape report landed on the desk of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was incandescent. 76 men had walked out of an escape-proof camp, while 70,000 Germans failed to stop them. The international press was already covering it. The escape was not just a security failure, it was a humiliation. And Hitler processed humiliation as a personal attack. His first order was simple: execute all 73 recaptured men. Then execute the senior British officers still inside the camp as collective punishment. Göring pushed back, not on moral grounds, on practical ones. Eliminating every recaptured prisoner would be an undeniable, documentable violation of international law. The Red Cross would find out within weeks. Neutral nations would react. Allied governments would retaliate against German POWs. The propaganda cost would exceed the satisfaction. Keitel agreed. Himmler was consulted, and the compromise was delivered in 2 words: mehr als die Hälfte, more than half. 50 men would be executed, the remaining 23 would be returned to captivity. And every action would be disguised. Each man officially reported as shot while attempting to escape from custody, a bureaucratic fig leaf stretched over 50 cold-blooded acts. Göring was furious, not at the order, at the jurisdiction. These were Luftwaffe prisoners. The Gestapo had no authority over Luftwaffe POWs. This was a violation of military chain of command. Even within the machinery of the Third Reich, this was understood as crossing a line. But the order stood. 73 names were typed onto a list and delivered to an office in the Kriminalpolizei, Germany's criminal police division. A single officer was given the task: choose 50, cross off 23, provide no explanation for either decision. The list sat on a desk, the same desk from the opening of this video. A man picked up a pen. He read 73 names, and without requesting a single file, without asking a single question, he drew his line. But who was this man? Why did 50 deaths register as nothing more than a clerical task? The answer is the reason this isn't just a war story. It's something worse. If you've made it this far, do me a favor, hit subscribe. This channel covers stories like this. Stories where the real horror isn't in the headline, it's in the details nobody talks about. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the other side of what comes next. It's time to tell you who was sitting at that desk. His name was Arthur Nieb. Nieb was a career policeman, an early member of the Nazi Party. By 1944, he held one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in Germany, head of the Kriminalpolizei, the Reich's criminal police division, a senior bureaucrat, a man with a desk and a title. That's the first layer. Process it, hold it. Here's the second. In 1941, Arthur Nieb was assigned to the Eastern Front. He was given command of Einsatzgruppe B. If you don't know that word, you need to. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile units with a single directive. They followed the German army into the Soviet Union, and their mission was extermination. Jewish people, Roma, communists, anyone designated undesirable. Einsatzgruppe B operated in Belarus. Under Arthur Neeb's direct command, more than 45,000 men, women, and children were killed, eliminated at the edges of pits they had been forced to dig. Entire villages erased from the map in a single afternoon. 45,000. That is not a metaphor. That is a body count. 45,000. Now go back to the hook. The man who didn't hesitate. The man who moved on to his next task. Recalculate what those words mean when the man holding the pen has already overseen the deaths of 45,000 human beings. 50 names on a list? That was a slow morning. But there's a third layer, and it's the one that should make your stomach turn. The mass operations on the Eastern Front were causing psychological breakdowns among Nebe's own men. SS soldiers were drinking themselves unconscious. Some were requesting transfers. Some were taking their own lives. The act of carrying out these operations, including against children, at close range, was destroying the perpetrators themselves. Nebe's response was not to stop. His response was to find a more efficient method. He was directly involved in developing mobile chambers, sealed trucks, engine exhaust redirected into the cargo compartment. Victims were loaded in alive and driven in circles until the carbon monoxide did its work. This was not designed to reduce suffering for the people inside. It was designed to reduce discomfort for the men outside. Arthur Nebe helped pioneer industrialized elimination, not out of ideology, but out of project management. The operations were too stressful for his personnel, so he engineered the stress away. The same instinct that solves a staffing problem or optimizes a supply chain. This is the man who sat at the desk. This is the man who held the pen. A man for whom 50 was not a number that caused hesitation. It was a rounding error in a career measured in tens of thousands. The selection was not a crisis for Arthur Nebe. It was a task, and that is far more terrifying than if he'd agonized over it. So how did he choose? 73 men, nearly identical on paper, all Allied officers, all captured aircrew, all guilty of the same offense, escaping. What separated the 50 from the 23? Here is what we know. No Americans were included, not one. But this isn't mercy, it's mathematics. All American POWs had been transferred out of North Compound before the escape. None participated. Even so, Germany was careful not to provoke the United States beyond the existing war footing. Diplomatic calculation protected certain passports. Conscience protected nobody. The British bore the heaviest losses, but officers from occupied nations were also targeted. Norwegians, Czechs, Poles, Greeks, Frenchmen. Some nationalities appeared to receive partial protection. Others received none. The pattern is inconsistent enough to resist any clean explanation. Look at specific cases. Wings Day. One of the most famous serial escapers in the entire war, a camp leader, a man the Germans knew by name, was spared. Neither was Jimmy James, another persistent offender, selected. Both were sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp instead. Why? Possibly because their profiles were too high. Their deaths would have been too hard to disguise as escape attempts. There are accounts suggesting certain names triggered diplomatic hesitation. A surname that sounded too much like a prominent Allied family. Even the regime that was responsible for millions of deaths still paused at the wrong surname on a list. Roger Bushell was not spared. He was never going to be. Big X, the mastermind, the man the Gestapo had personally warned. His name was likely the first one on the list, circled before the pen touched any other name. But here is the detail that answers the question this video has been asking. 2 men, Same rank, same nationality, same escape route. Recaptured at the same time in the same place. Their files were nearly identical. One was driven to a quiet road outside town and never came back. The other was returned to Stalag Luft 3. He survived the war. He went home to his family. No one has ever identified a reason for the difference. Same rank, same country, same route, same moment of capture. One lived, one didn't. Sit with that for a moment. The executions were carried out across Germany and occupied territory. Small groups, 2 or 3 men at a time, driven by car to remote locations, told they could step out, stretch their legs, relieve themselves, then struck down from behind. Remains cremated immediately. Ashes placed in urns. The urns were sent back to Stalag Luft 3. When they arrived, when the surviving prisoners learned what had happened, the senior British officer demanded an explanation from the German commandant. The Luftwaffe command was shaken. These had been their prisoners. The Gestapo had taken their lives without authority, without consultation, without even informing the camp. The prisoners were ordered to build a memorial for their own dead. They did. It still stands. And the answer to the question this entire video has been building toward, crystallizes into something almost impossible to accept. Beyond broad, nationality-level diplomatic calculations, the selection was functionally arbitrary. There was no algorithm, no scoring system, no hierarchy of guilt. A man who had been responsible for 45,000 deaths drew a line under name 50 and stopped. Some of the 23 lived because a pen moved 3 lines further down a page instead of stopping. That's not a pattern. That's a coin flip disguised as a bureaucratic process. The war ended. The machinery of Allied justice began grinding through the wreckage. Nuremberg, the major war crimes trials, the systematic prosecution of crimes so vast they required new legal vocabulary. The fate of 50 prisoners of war from Stalag Luft 3 was, in that triage, a mid-priority case. Terrible. Documented. But smaller in scale than the Holocaust, the Eastern Front operations, the death camps, it risked becoming a footnote. Enter Frank McKenna. McKenna was a former beat constable from Blackpool, Lancashire, just a copper, a man who had walked a seaside town checking locks on shop doors. By 1945, he was an RAF Special Investigation Branch officer, and he made a decision that defined everything that followed. He would not treat this as one mass atrocity. He would treat it as 50 individual cases. Each man got his own case file. Each death was investigated separately. Who drove the car? Who carried out the act? Who gave the order at the local level? Who signed the cremation paperwork? 50 victims, 50 cases. Think about what McKenna was doing. Arthur Neeb had reduced 50 men to a list, names on paper, interchangeable, crossable off. McKenna reversed the process. He took a list and turned it back into 50 men. 50 individuals with names and ranks and families and specific, traceable deaths. One man had dehumanized through bureaucracy. Another rehumanized through the exact same tool. McKenna's investigation spanned years, multiple countries. He tracked down Gestapo operatives through the shattered infrastructure of post-war Germany. He followed paper trails through bombed-out filing cabinets. He conducted interrogations in ruined police stations. He cross-referenced cremation records with transport logs. 18 men were eventually identified, tried by military tribunal, and held accountable for their roles. 18 triggermen and drivers and local commanders. Real justice, real consequences. But the architects were beyond reach. Hitler had perished in his bunker. Himmler had taken a cyanide capsule during British captivity. Kaltenbrunner was held accountable at Nuremberg, but for crimes so much larger that the 50 barely registered in his indictment. And Arthur Neba, the man with the pen? McKenna never got to him. Not because Neba escaped, not because he hid. Because by the time the war ended, Neba was already gone, taken by the same regime he had served. Arthur Neba was arrested in January 1945. Not for the fate of 50 Allied prisoners of war, not for the 45,000 dead in Belarus, not for the sealed trucks, not for any of it. He was arrested for his involvement in the July 20th plot, the failed attempt to take the life of Adolf Hitler the previous summer. The regime's own machinery turned on one of its most experienced operators, not for what he had done to others, for what he had tried to do to his Führer. Neba was executed in March 1945, weeks before the war ended, weeks before the camps were liberated, before the full scale of what men like him had built became visible to the world. The man who chose 50 men to die was himself chosen to die by the same system, through the same indifference. And that is the final answer to the question this video has been asking. What decided who lived and who died among those 73 men? Not courage, not cowardice, not rank, not cunning, not the quality of their forged papers, or the speed of their legs, or the cleverness of their cover stories. Not anything they did or failed to do. A man who had already been responsible for more deaths than he could count sat at a desk, moved his pen down a list, and stopped at 50. Some of the 23 lived because the pen stopped where it stopped. Some of the 50 died because it hadn't stopped yet. That's it. That's the answer. There was no algorithm. There was no reason. There was a man who had forgotten how to count the dead as people, and a pen, and a number. Mehr als die Hälfte. And the rest was silence. The Great Escape was not defeated by barbed wire. It was not defeated by searchlights or microphones or yellow sand. It was defeated by something no tunnel could get under and no forged document could fool. The absolute indifference of a bureaucrat for whom 50 lives weighed nothing at all. 600 men spent a year building something extraordinary. 336 feet of tunnel, electric lights, an underground railway. A feat of engineering and courage that still staggers the imagination 80 years later. And all of it was undone by a man with a pen who didn't even look up. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone. If you want more stories like this, stories where the real question isn't what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, subscribe. I'll be here. Thanks for watching.